Hello everybody, thank you for being with us today. In this video, we will introduce you to the 2022 update of the EDHECinfra ESG taxonomy of impacts and risks. We will discuss what the ESG taxonomy is, how we built the taxonomy, specifically its objectives, the methodology followed, the design principles used, and the structure in which the taxonomy was based. We then introduce you to the contents of the ESG taxonomy and finally discuss the further research enabled by the development of the ESG taxonomy. What is a taxonomy? In a generic sense, a taxonomy or a taxonomical classification is a scheme of classification, especially a hierarchical classification in which things are organized into groups or types. Now, the EDHECinfra ESG taxonomy is a classification system of the environmental, social, and governance aspects applicable to infrastructure companies. The first version of the EDHECinfra ESG taxonomy was published last year. This video presents the 2022 version of the taxonomy. Building the ESG taxonomy. This section introduces you to the objectives, methodology, design principles, and structure of the ESG taxonomy. Like the 2021 version, the starting point of the 2022 taxonomy was a review of 12 standards widely used to understand and assess the ESG performance of infrastructure companies. The reviewed standards are presented on the screen on the right. The review of these standards included the analysis and categorization of 4,000 plus individual disclosures used by these frameworks. These were then distilled to identify ESG aspects relevant for infrastructure companies. This guided the development of the ESG taxonomy. Where possible, the development of classes of the taxonomy was made compatible with international theoretical or empirical frameworks such as the TCFD, TNFD, G20 and OECD principles of corporate governance, etc. The key characteristics of the taxonomy are as follows. First, the taxonomy is specific to infrastructure. That is, it defines the boundaries of ESG applicable for infrastructure companies. 2. While it is standard agnostic, it can be used to map all standards against each other. This is a previously published analysis that you can find on our website. Third, the unit of account is infrastructure companies. That is, the taxonomy takes the point of view of investors. Finally, the taxonomy focuses distinctly on the environmental and social impacts and risks, which is something that current schemes do not do. Design principles of the ESG taxonomy. The first design principle that the taxonomy is based on is that of double materiality, which means that an infrastructure company has impacts on the environment and on the society, and these impacts in turn create risks for the infrastructure company. The second principle followed is that of an inheritance-based classification system, wherein the classes of the ESG taxonomy are defined using a hierarchical structure of superclasses, classes, and subclasses. In turn, these classes are based on the following principles. First, salience. That is, these classes are important to capture. Second, credibility. That is, the classes are scientifically valid. Third, independence. That is, classes capture unique information. Fourth, measurability. That is, it is realistic to qualify classes either by using reported data, quantitative information, or other techniques. Finally, reliability. That is, classes are consistently measurable over time. Structure of the ESG taxonomy. The ESG taxonomy has three pillars: the environmental pillar, the social pillar, and the governance pillar. The environmental and social pillar have two dimensions of impacts and risks. Infrastructure companies, by means of their activities and operations, can have a negative or positive impact on the environment and on the society, which in turn may drive the risks that the company faces from the environment and the society. Within these dimensions, we have verticals that identify the actor on which the company has an impact on or faces a risk from. These verticals are also called superclasses of the ESG taxonomy. Within the environmental pillar, the verticals are nature and climate change, while within the social pillar, the verticals are customers, general public, employees, and regulators. The structure is different for the governance pillar since a company cannot impact or face a risk from itself. The governance pillar instead defines a set of principles that infrastructure companies can follow to enable effective management. This section introduces you to the contents of the ESG taxonomy of impacts and risks displayed by pillar. This is the environmental pillar of the ESG taxonomy. As explained before, the environmental pillar has two verticals, that of nature and climate change. A vertical is also called a superclass. Within each vertical are a set of classes that collectively identify the individual categories relevant from an environmental or social perspective of infrastructure companies. Within each class are a set of subclasses that outline the actual impacts that an infrastructure company has on the parent class or the actual risks that the infrastructure company faces from the parent class. Infrastructure companies invest in large immobile capital assets that have little to no alternative use. Given their significant physical footprint, they typically impact important areas of land and require substantial amounts of material and natural resources to build, operate, maintain, refurbish, and decommission. Throughout their life cycle, infrastructure assets thus impact all aspects of stock of natural capital, from biodiversity to oceans and freshwater, land, and the atmosphere. Indeed, as the backbone of the modern economy, the ultimate role of infrastructure is often to support consumption of energy by economic agents engaged in activities that require considerable amounts of energy, the vast majority of which is currently sourced from fossil fuels. Hence, most infrastructure contributes to a large degree of greenhouse gas emissions. Infrastructure assets are also exposed to multiple risks based on their location, design, and activities. Their rigid and static nature implies that acute and chronic physical risk can cause significant damage to these assets. Physical hazards can render the infrastructure asset inoperable, cause damage to the asset, or to supporting infrastructure. Environmental degradation may also lead to limiting or preventing an infrastructure from functioning normally if a certain resource becomes unavailable. Taken together, the classes of impacts and risks that make up the environmental pillar are presented in the screen. The social pillar of the ESG taxonomy. Infrastructure is created to provide specific services to end users, most of whom tend to be the general public as well as public and private sector organizations. However, because they often provide essential services, the activities of an infrastructure company also have significant social impacts on individuals, households, the economy, and society. Further, infrastructure companies and services enable economic development by impacting the value of adjacent land, real estate, and enabling businesses and other infrastructure. Infrastructure companies can have a range of impacts on the collective welfare of the general public by either infringing or protecting human rights, impacting public health, disturbing or improving the quality of life in public places, and preserving, promoting, or degrading the heritage and culture. Regulators are also an important social actor for the infrastructure asset class. Building of infrastructure requires long-term support of regulator and timely regulatory engagement. Next, we look at the social risks faced by the infrastructure asset class. Infrastructure companies are exposed to social acceptability risks, risk of workforce availability, and regulatory risks. Social acceptability is a central issue when investing in private infra companies, as infrastructure assets have a significant environmental footprint that can lead to disruption for surrounding populations. Further, for-profit private operations of infrastructure companies is also a highly controversial issue in a number of countries. The social acceptability risk of infra companies is split between the perception of its customers and that of the general public. Workforce availability is another class of social risks for infrastructure companies. Finally, regulators, by means of updating or implementing new legislation, for example, implementation of a carbon tax, can pose a risk to the operations of infrastructure companies. Regulatory intervention in case of poor performance or poor acceptability of specific companies or sectors can also pose a risk of fines, nationalization where applicable, and business closure. Taken together, the classes of impacts and risks that make up the social pillar of the taxonomy are presented here. The governance pillar of the ESG taxonomy. The governance of a company refers to effective corporate governance. The governance pillar of the taxonomy outlines a set of principles that infrastructure companies can use to facilitate their effective management. This is aligned with the G20 and OECD principles of corporate governance. The final section of this video presents how we can use the ESG taxonomy as a tool to create ESG knowledge and facilitate the creation of an ESG database for infrastructure assets globally. Measuring ESG impacts and risks. The ESG taxonomy presents a list of environmental and social impacts and risks material to the infrastructure asset class. The next step is to measure for all infrastructure asset types these outlined impacts and risks, starting with greenhouse gases, physical risks, social acceptability of the public, and social acceptability of the customers. This measurement will be done in an objective and systematic manner, calculated using a set of globally observable factors. For example, Scope 3 emissions of an airport can be measured by the factors of LTO and cruise emissions of airplanes. To identify the factors, we will be developing a set of documents known as exposure profiles, which are academic-style documents backed up with sector-specific literature review, which present a review of methodologies or initiatives used by sector-specific international organizations to measure and report the ESG aspects of interest. Third, which present a list of science-based factors that can be used to determine the relative risk exposure or impact of any given infrastructure company. Finally, these are sector-specific extensions of the ESG taxonomy that enable the identification of factors to measure ESG impacts and risks. The next step would be to collect data on these identified factors and calculate the ESG impact and risk exposures. Thank you for watching this video. More information on the ESG taxonomy of impacts and risks for infrastructure companies can be found in an upcoming publication of the EDHECinfra Institute.